Hi, my name is David Jenkins, although I'm often known in the industry just as DJ. I'm a white bald man with a dark ginger beard and glasses, wearing a black and red check shirt. I'm reading this talk from a script for my own reasons, which will soon become apparent, but also so you can be provided with a copy of the transcript should you need it. To round me out a bit more as a person, I'm 38, boringly cishet, I'm engaged, a father of 2, and I'm sure it will come as no surprise to any of you to learn, I'm also a massive nerd. I've been working in the games industry for over 12 years now, mostly within game quality, with the rest, as I am now, in release management. I started as a member of the Xbox certification team as a compliance tester, then lead, and finally senior lead, before becoming the compliance lead at Sega Europe, where I doubled as a functionality lead, mobile test lead, and even website test lead. I was also involved in putting together and assessing our games against Sega's first set of accessibility best practices. From there, I moved to a release management role at Curve Games, then spent 4 years as lead and then head of QA at the award-winning studio Roll7. When that was very sadly shut down by Take-Two a couple of years ago, I did some consultancy work, helped create the Foundation Certificate in Game Quality as a subject matter expert, and started a podcast before landing my current role as release manager at Megabit Publishing and Aonic, where I also oversee game quality and accessibility. Scattered amongst all that, I've done some ad hoc work as a producer, voice actor in Rollerdrome, and even lent my voice to a skateboarding-themed sea shanty for one of the AuDHD World trailers, because why not? I've been part of teams that have won BAFTAs, DICE Awards, Developer Awards, Tiger Awards, and more. My team at Roll7 was shortlisted for Quality Team of the Year, and I was also listed. Scattered amongst all that, I've done some ad hoc work as a producer, voice actor in Rollerdrome, and even lent my voice to a skateboarding-themed sea shanty for one of the AuDHD World trailers, because why not? I've been part of teams that have won BAFTAs, DICE Awards, Developer Awards, Tiger Awards, and more. My team at Roll7 was shortlisted for Quality Team of the Year, and I was also shortlisted for an award for my work in EDI. And that's on top of supporting groups like Limit Break as a mentor, Intergames, and GameQuality.org. It's been quite the career already. So, why am I here talking to you at GAConf? Well, other than my particular interest in games accessibility, it's because a few years ago, while I was at Roll7, I received a diagnosis for both autism and ADHD. Actually, after a few months of therapy with a specialist, my autism was basically a given, but the ADHD took us both by surprise. Must have been 2 for 1 day or something. In fact, we were pretty certain of the outcome before I'd even submitted my answers to the RADS questionnaire. For those who don't know, it's one of the assessment tools they use where you're asked to tick boxes to say which statements don't apply to you, which apply to you as a kid, or which apply to you now. The thing is, I didn't feel like the range of possible responses was sufficient. In fact, we were pretty certain of the outcome before I'd even submitted my answers to the RADS questionnaire. For those who don't know, it's one of those assessment tools they use where you're asked to tick boxes to say which statements don't apply, applied to you as a kid, or apply to you now. The thing is, I didn't feel like the range of possible responses was sufficient, because some things applied to me now, but only in a work environment, or only when I'm at home. Some applied all the time, some were very sporadic, etc. To fix this, I created a color coding system, which enabled me to answer with more nuance. When I showed it to my therapist, she laughed, because as it turned out, I had essentially answered the autism questionnaire in the most autistic way possible. So yeah, if she wasn't convinced already by that point, as far as she was concerned, it was now nailed on. And to be fair, she was right. For me, that diagnosis was a revelation, both personally and professionally. Oh, and it's also why I've scripted this, because between my autistic brain wanting to talk for hours about this subject and my ADHD brain constantly running off with its own topics of conversation, I'd be going well over the 15-minute target if I just freestyled it. On a personal level, it framed so many of my experiences growing up and even trying to adult. Suddenly, I could let go of situations I had continued to look back on with confusion, angry at myself for not being able to understand seemingly basic social concepts, or upset with myself for whatever it was I'd done to deserve the bullying from peers and abuse from partners. I'm a textbook apologizer because I always assume everything is, at least in some small way, my fault, that I could have done more. But now, with that better understanding of the reasons why I'm the way I am, I've also learned to be more forgiving of my past. I'm even more forgiving of myself for things I do now. For example, I struggle with eye contact, and I'm terrible with names, unless they're from some fantasy, sci-fi, or comic book universe. I sometimes find facial expressions and tone of voice difficult, both in terms of understanding them and in terms of delivering them correctly. I overthink things like you wouldn't believe, and that includes the obligatory 2 a.m. internal conversation with myself as I plan out all possible scenarios from an interaction that will probably never happen, like trying to decide what I'd say to a certain person if I ever met him face to orange face. Oh, and I'd say at least 40% of my conversations with people will feature a reference to The Office, Brooklyn Nine-Nine, or Parks and Recreation, among a few others. It's just how I process the world. So, what's it like being a neurodivergent person working in the games industry? Well, before I talk about my experiences specifically within games, I just wanted to caveat that these are just that, my own personal experiences. This may not be indicative of what it's generally like being neurodivergent and or disabled and working in games. But I would also add that, anecdotally at least, it is a very inclusive and welcoming industry. Oh, and if you don't get the joke in the title of this talk, it's a deep-cut pun on an old game called Full Spectrum Warrior. It was the first name I thought of, and having an 8-month-old means I don't get enough sleep for better ideas than that, it seems. So what's it like for me working in games? Well, when I sat down and thought about it, I had to laugh. I've spent my career in a discipline that requires you to look at everything from a bird's eye view, but also in meticulous detail, follow clear directions, but also think outside the box, make sure everything is exactly as it's supposed to be and meets a lot of specific guidelines, but also shout about it if something just feels wrong, deeply understand every facet of a project, but be ready to bounce around several of those projects in a day, and remain focused on the here and now, but always looking out for the early signs of future issues. And the more I explored and understood my own traits, the more it started to feel like I had essentially just made a career out of being neurodivergent without even knowing it. And with games absolutely being one of my special interests, that means I'm basically just paid to be autistic and ADHD, which is kind of great. Plus, Roll7 was a fully remote studio, so it also started to click why I found that setup so much more enjoyable, freeing, and efficient. I didn't have to deal with a commute, which means either boring traffic or lots of people, and having to be out of the house for 12 hours a day. A loud office space, again, very peoply, lovely as they all are, and a constant source of distraction. Eye contact, not an issue over Zoom calls. Missed or misunderstood communication, everything was written down in Slack for ease of later reference, and so on. I won't lie and say it's all sunshine and rainbows, though. What I would argue is just hyperfocus. Others might suggest is self-imposed crunch, which, if you don't know, is the thankfully diminishing practice of forcing teams to work long hours over an extended period in order to meet deadlines. What I see as my ADHD brain just bouncing between specialisms, others might argue is doing 4 jobs but only being paid for 1. What I see as dedication to my team and commitment to our players, others might see as being on call 24/7. I'm not saying anyone has specifically taken advantage of my neurodivergence, but I do need to be reminded, often by my amazingly supportive fiancé, but occasionally by my manager and colleagues, to allow myself some rest. On that podcast I mentioned, QA UDHD, if anyone's interested, I've even warned of things like burnout. I'm just not good at practicing what I preach on that. There have also been times of miscommunication and misunderstanding, and I know it's not just me because I've had neurodivergent colleagues come up to me and say things like, I thought the same as you, or I was just as surprised as you. This has led to everything from minor confusion to some fairly significant issues in my career. It's led me to be more mindful of potential gaps or misunderstandings, misinterpretations in my understandings, and to plug those gaps by getting written confirmation and asking more questions, although the latter has been known to annoy some people. Meetings at work can also be interesting. You can pretty much pick out the neurodivergent ones in our team because someone will say something in a particular way or inadvertently deliver some obscure quote from a show we all like, and only 4 or 5 of us will snicker under our breath while everyone else carries on oblivious. My poor manager, though. Everyone on our team is neurodivergent in some way, if not more than one. However, he is fortunately very patient and very understanding. What has working in games done for me? Well, it's kind of crazy when you think about it. I finally moved out of my parents' house when I landed the job at Sega. I bought my own home and had my first child when I got the job at Curve. I got my life-affirming AuDHD diagnosis while living my best life working remotely at Roll7, and got to look suave in a tux on stage at the BAFTA Awards. And now I have another beautiful baby boy, a wedding to plan, and a host of exciting personal projects keeping me busy now that I'm at Aonic. On another upside, I've made some amazing friends working in games. As my therapist used to say, I found my tribe, which is hardly surprising since there's such a disproportionately high number of neurodivergent people in the games industry. As you may have already noticed, we have a huge, passionate, welcoming community of people, supported by amazing groups like Autistic at Play, Playing Attention, Limit Break Mentorship, Impact, and of course, GAConf. In fact, at my very first Develop Brighton conference, I attended a roundtable discussion for neurodivergent professionals, and, well, for one thing, it became immediately apparent that we needed one of the bigger rooms, and for another, we learned very quickly why you don't stick 3 people with ADHD in charge of a short, open-ended discussion about neurodivergence. We talked about 20 different things, completely lost track of who had questions, got very little done, and ran over time. But we did all have a great laugh. I personally felt very at home, and you could tell how happy everyone was that the session even existed in the first place. Also at that conference, I heard my first talk on the value of and principles behind good UX design, and realised how much it overlapped with the work I'd been doing for years in and around accessibility. This led to a 3-year autistic deep dive into UX, human-computer interaction, playtesting, user experience research, and so on. From that, I've started working more closely with our lead community developer, who runs internal and external playtesting, player experience studies, studios, and so on. It never ceases to amaze how much you can personally get from either sticking with one discipline and becoming the best at it you can be, or from bouncing around and learning lots of different skills in different areas. It's practically impossible to get bored working in games. On another note about amazing people, it's been great in recent years to feel so seen and understood. For example, we did some karaoke at a work event a while ago, and only a few of my colleagues were aware that I take singing quite seriously. Yes, that's me. Which meant it came as a shock when little old me busted out Me and Mrs. Jones, Go the Distance, and Dream On, including the high parts. So much so that someone asked one of my team, "Where did that come from? He's usually so quiet." To which they responded, "Yeah, but you gave him a microphone. This is one of his special interests." That sort of advocacy and acknowledgement of my little quirks just made me feel so much like I belong. Although don't get me wrong, I still get imposter syndrome. Doing this, for one thing. And I mean, I mentioned being a subject matter expert on that course for gamesquality.org. The intro to the course online says it was put together by some of the greatest minds working in game development today. And it was. There was a very experienced QA architect from Epic Games, the operations manager from Xbox Studios Quality, someone who literally wrote a book on games QA, and similarly experienced people from Ubisoft, PlayStation Studios, and me. Yeah. I'm incredibly proud of myself for not being considered out of place amongst all that, and so very grateful for the opportunity. But I read that and my brain just went, and Peggy, like in Hamilton. The struggle is real. Anyway, in conclusion, what's it like being a neurodivergent person working in the games industry? Well, to reinforce what I said earlier about relating to the world largely through quotes from The Office, I've worked in this industry for over 12 years. My job has largely been to identify issues, raise concerns about product risks, and report bugs. Even if I didn't love every minute of it, everything I have, I owe to this industry. This stupid, wonderful, definitely not boring, amazing industry. Thank you for listening. And if you want to find me on socials or follow the QA AuDHD podcast, here's what you need to look for. I hope you enjoyed the rest of GAConf. I know I will.